You know that feeling that hits you about 2 hours after lunch, that heavy, almost sedated exhaustion that makes you want to sit down in a quiet room and close your eyes for a few minutes. The kind of tiredness that isn't just about being sleepy, it's almost physical, like your legs are filled with something dense. And then sometimes there's the foggy thinking, the slight headache behind the eyes, the sensation that you just can't quite focus the way you want to. Or maybe it's something else for you. Maybe it's the dry mouth that wakes you at 2 or 3 in the morning and you've gotten used to keeping a glass of water on the nightstand. Or that frequent trip to the bathroom before dawn, not once, but 2 or 3 times. And by the time you've gone back to bed, you can't fall back into proper sleep. Or the tingling in your feet that no one has given you a satisfying explanation for. The slightly blurred vision in the morning that clears up after a while. The strange craving for something sweet right around 4 in the afternoon, almost like clockwork. If any of those things sound like your day, like your body, I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes. Because what I'm going to explain is not what you've typically heard. And I think by the time we get to the end, you'll understand something about your body that you didn't fully understand before. Here's the first thing I want you to hear clearly. You've probably been told that this is about sugar, that if you just stop eating sweets, cut back on bread, avoid the obvious things. White rice, potatoes, pastries, juice, your blood sugar will come under control. And you may have already done all of that. You may have been disciplined about it for months, even years, and you're still seeing numbers that concern you or still feeling these symptoms day after day. That advice isn't wrong, but it is incomplete. And for people over the age of 65, it is significantly incomplete because the problem is not just about how much sugar you eat. The problem is how your body handles glucose. And that is a different conversation entirely. Today, I want to explain exactly what that means. I'm going to walk you through 5 specific food strategies that directly address blood sugar regulation in a body that is over 65. Not general advice, not vague recommendations. Specific strategies with specific timing, specific quantities, and a specific sequence you can follow. But first, you need to understand what's actually happening in your body. Because without understanding the mechanism, the advice makes no sense and you won't stick to it. My name is Dr. James Mercer. I spent over 30 years in internal medicine, and for the last 12 of those years, almost all of my patients were 65 and older. I've had this conversation about blood sugar more times than I can count. And the one thing that strikes me every single time is this: the people who struggle most are not struggling because they're irresponsible about their diet. They're struggling because the guidance they've received was designed for a younger body. And your body at this stage of life functions by different rules. So let me start there. Let's talk about what actually changes. When you eat, your body breaks down carbohydrates into glucose, simple sugar, and releases it into the bloodstream. Your pancreas responds by secreting insulin, which acts as a signal to your cells. Open up, let the glucose in, use it for energy. That's the normal, healthy process. But here's what happens after 65 and what almost nobody explains in plain terms. First, insulin sensitivity decreases. Your cells don't respond to insulin as quickly or as efficiently as they once did. The signal is still being sent, but the response is slower. So your pancreas has to produce more insulin than before to move the same amount of glucose out of the bloodstream. And when the pancreas is chronically overworked for years, sometimes decades, it begins to lose some of its capacity. This is the progression from insulin resistance to prediabetes to type 2 diabetes. And it happens gradually, quietly, without dramatic warning signs. Second, and this is the piece that genuinely surprises most people when I explain it, muscle mass decreases with age. This is called sarcopenia, and it begins in our 40s but accelerates significantly after 60. Now, why does muscle matter for blood sugar? Because muscle tissue is the single largest site of glucose disposal in the human body. When glucose enters the bloodstream after a meal, the majority of it under normal conditions, gets absorbed by muscle. When muscle mass decreases, there is simply less tissue available to absorb that glucose, so it remains in the bloodstream longer. This is not a failure of discipline. This is a structural change in the body's ability to manage glucose. And this is why cutting sugar alone is often not enough. Third, and I'll come back to this in detail later because it's critical, your liver plays a role in blood sugar regulation that most people don't know about. Your liver stores glucose and releases it into the bloodstream in response to certain hormones, particularly cortisol. And at this stage of life, the rhythm of that release can become dysregulated. The result is that your fasting blood sugar in the morning is higher than it was when you went to bed, even though you haven't eaten anything overnight. If you've ever noticed this and wondered why, that explanation is coming. Stay with me now. I promised you 5 specific strategies. Let me give you the first one, and it is probably the simplest, least expensive, most underused tool in blood sugar management. And almost nobody talks about it clearly enough. It's the order in which you eat your food, not what you eat. The order here is what the research shows, and there have been several well-designed studies on this, including work from Cornell University and repeated studies done in Japan and Sweden. When you eat carbohydrates first at a meal, bread before the salad, rice before the vegetables, cereal before the eggs, the glucose from those carbohydrates enters the bloodstream rapidly. Within about 15 to 20 minutes, blood sugar begins to rise sharply. That sharp rise triggers a large insulin response, and it's that spike and crash pattern that drives the fatigue, the brain fog, and the cravings you feel hours later. But when you eat vegetables first, any vegetables, raw or cooked, the fiber in those vegetables physically coats the walls of the small intestine. It creates a kind of buffer, and when the carbohydrates come along later in the meal, they are absorbed through that fibrous layer at a significantly slower rate. The glucose rise is gentler, the insulin response is smaller, and the energy you feel over the next 2 to 3 hours is far more stable. The sequence that works best is this: vegetables first, then protein, then carbohydrates last. So before you touch the bread on your plate, eat the salad. Before the rice, eat the chicken and the steamed broccoli. Before the potato, eat the fish and the green beans. This one change, made consistently at every meal, reduces post-meal blood sugar peaks by 20 to 30% in most people, not because you're eating less. Because of the order, this is the first strategy. It costs nothing. It requires no special food. It just requires intention. Let me give you the second strategy. And this one goes against something many people in your generation were told for decades: fat, not in excess. But the right kind in the right timing. For years, dietary fat was treated as the enemy. Low-fat products filled the supermarket shelves. People were told to avoid egg yolks, use margarine instead of butter, cut back on nuts and oils. And a generation of people who followed that advice carefully are now dealing with blood sugar problems in part because of it. Here's what fat actually does at a meal. It slows the rate at which your stomach empties into the small intestines. This is called delayed gastric emptying, and in the context of blood sugar management, it is genuinely helpful. When the stomach empties more slowly, food, including carbohydrates, is released into the intestine more gradually. The glucose absorption rate slows. The blood sugar curve flattens. A small amount of healthy fat before or with a carbohydrate-containing meal makes a measurable difference to the blood sugar response. What does this look like in practice? A teaspoon of extra virgin olive oil drizzled over your vegetables before you eat. 6 to 10 walnuts eaten at the beginning of lunch. Half a small avocado alongside your meal. A thin spread of natural almond butter on whole grain bread rather than jam or honey. These are not dramatic changes, but the cumulative effect on blood sugar stability, particularly over weeks and months, is meaningful. The right fat at the right time is a tool, not a problem. Now I want to tell you about a third strategy, and I'm going to ask you to hold this one in mind for a few minutes because I'll give you the exact details shortly. But the principle involves a specific liquid taken at a specific time that has been studied quite extensively for its effect on glucose absorption. I want you to understand the mechanism first before I give you the specifics, because if you understand why it works, you'll actually use it. But first, let me address the third factor in the blood sugar puzzle, because it directly connects to the strategy I'm about to describe, movement after meals. After you finish eating, your blood sugar begins rising within about 15 minutes. It peaks somewhere between 45 minutes and 90 minutes after the meal begins, depending on what you ate and how you ate it. During that window, that rise and peak, there is one intervention that is remarkably effective at reducing the peak, and it is walking, not exercise in the way most people think about exercise, not a vigorous walk, not a gym session, just walking. 10 to 15 minutes of gentle movement after eating activates the muscles of your legs, your core, your lower body, and here's the critical point. Skeletal muscle, when it is contracting and moving, absorbs glucose directly from the bloodstream through a mechanism that does not require insulin. It bypasses the insulin pathway entirely. The glucose transporters in your muscle cells activate in response to physical movement, regardless of your insulin levels. This means that a short walk after lunch reduces your post-meal blood sugar peak significantly, even if your insulin sensitivity is impaired, even if your pancreas is struggling. The movement itself pulls glucose out of the bloodstream through a completely separate door. Studies measuring this effect consistently show reductions of between 20 and 30% in post-meal glucose peaks from just 15 minutes of gentle walking. Published in journals including Diabologia and the New England Journal of Medicine. The data on this is solid for people who have joint pain or who cannot walk freely, standing and doing light arm movements, marching gently on the spot in the kitchen, or doing 10 minutes of light household activity achieves a very similar effect. The key is not the intensity, it is the muscular contraction. Any movement that engages the large muscles of the body, legs particularly, during the 90-minute window after eating matters. Make this a habit after lunch specifically, because lunch is typically the meal when blood sugar rises most unpredictably. After dinner, if you can manage a 10-minute walk in the evening air, so much the better. But if you only do it once, do it after lunch. Now, I told you I wanted to explain a specific liquid taken at a specific time. Here it is, apple cider vinegar. I know what you're thinking. You've heard about this before. You may have dismissed it as a wellness trend, and I understand that reaction entirely. But let me tell you what the actual mechanism is, because it is not folk wisdom. It is documented biochemistry. The active compound in apple cider vinegar is acetic acid. Acetic acid does two things that are directly relevant to blood sugar. First, it partially inhibits an enzyme in the gut called alpha amylase. Alpha amylase is responsible for breaking down complex starches into simple sugars during digestion. When you slow that enzyme down, the conversion of starch to glucose is slower. The glucose appears in the bloodstream more gradually. The blood sugar rise is more gradual. Second, acetic acid improves insulin sensitivity in muscle tissue. It makes the cells more responsive to the insulin signal. It helps open that stiff lock I described earlier. Multiple controlled studies, including work published in Diabetes Care, have confirmed that taking a small amount of apple cider vinegar before a carbohydrate-containing meal reduces the post-meal blood sugar peak measurably. The effect is modest on its own, but combined with the meal sequence and the post-meal movement, it contributes meaningfully to the overall pattern. The way to use this is precise. 1 tablespoon, not more, of apple cider vinegar diluted in a large glass of water, at least 250 milliliters of water. You can add a small slice of lemon if the taste bothers you. Drink this 15 minutes before your largest meal of the day, which for most people is either lunch or dinner. Never drink apple cider vinegar undiluted. The acidity is strong enough to damage tooth enamel and irritate the lining of the esophagus. Always dilute it, always. Drink it through a straw if you have sensitive teeth. And if you have a history of stomach ulcers, acid reflux, or any esophageal condition, speak with your doctor before starting this. But used correctly, diluted before a meal consistently, this is one of the simplest and most underappreciated tools available. Now, I want to talk about breakfast because there is one mistake that I see made by the majority of people over 65 who are trying to manage their blood sugar. And it happens before 9 o'clock in the morning. The mistake is starting the day with a carbohydrate-dominant breakfast that contains little or no protein. Think about what a typical breakfast looks like. Toast with marmalade or butter, a bowl of oatmeal with fruit and honey, orange juice, and a bowl of cereal. Fruit and yogurt, if the yogurt is a flavored, sweetened variety. These breakfasts are not terrible in isolation. But for someone with blood sugar sensitivity, which after 65 describes most of us to some degree, beginning the day with a carbohydrate load without significant protein, causes a blood sugar spike within the first hour of the morning. That spike is followed by a drop, and that drop drives mid-morning hunger, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and often the urge to snack on something sweet before noon. The solution is simple, and it does not require you to give up foods you enjoy. Start every morning with protein first. Before any carbohydrate, before the toast, the oatmeal, the fruit, eat protein. 2 eggs scrambled, poached, or soft boiled. A small portion of smoked fish. Plain Greek yogurt, the unsweetened kind, with a small handful of nuts. A tablespoon of natural peanut butter or almond butter on its own before the bread. Even a small piece of cheese, protein first. Then, after you have eaten your protein, add the carbohydrates you want, the whole grain toast, the oats, the fruit. They will behave completely differently in your bloodstream when they follow protein rather than leading it. People who make this single change consistently tell me within 2 to 3 weeks that the afternoon fatigue has reduced, that they feel more mentally alert across the morning, that they're not reaching for biscuits at 11 o'clock, not because the breakfast is radically different in what it contains, but because the blood sugar pattern across the morning has become far more stable. This is not a small thing. The morning blood sugar trajectory sets the tone for the entire day. A good morning pattern leads to better choices, better energy, and more stable numbers throughout the afternoon. A poor morning pattern creates a cascade of spikes and drops that is very difficult to recover from before evening. If you're watching this and thinking, yes, that describes my mornings, I'd like you to write something in the comments below. Just write the word morning and tell me what your typical breakfast looks like. I find it helpful to understand what people are actually eating, and I do read these. Now, let me come back to something I mentioned earlier and haven't fully explained yet, the liver. Because this is the part that most people have genuinely never heard explained, and it is critical if you are someone who wakes up with higher fasting blood sugar than you had when you went to sleep. Your liver stores glucose in a compound called glycogen. Think of it as a reserve fuel tank. Through the night, as your body runs on that stored fuel, the liver periodically releases some glucose into the bloodstream to keep your brain functioning while you fast. But here's where it gets complicated. In the early morning hours, typically between 3 and 6 a.m., your body begins preparing to wake up. Part of that preparation involves a natural rise in cortisol, the hormone associated with alertness and physical readiness. Cortisol signals the liver to release additional glucose in anticipation of waking activity. This is called the dawn phenomenon, and it is a normal physiological process. In younger insulin-sensitive bodies, the insulin response catches up quickly, and fasting blood sugar remains stable. In an older body with reduced insulin sensitivity, the liver releases glucose, but the cells are slower to take it up. And when you measure your blood sugar at 7 in the morning, it may be higher than it was at midnight. Not because you ate anything, because your liver released glucose during the night and your body didn't absorb it efficiently. This is why many people who eat carefully and avoid evening snacking still wake up with elevated fasting numbers. And it can be deeply discouraging when nobody explains why it's happening. There are two things that address this specifically. First, sleep consistency. Your cortisol rhythm is tied to your sleep-wake cycle. When you go to bed at irregular hours, 11 one night, 1 in the morning the next, your cortisol pattern becomes irregular, and the dawn glucose release becomes more unpredictable. Going to bed within the same 30-minute window every night, not a perfect schedule, but a consistent one, helps regulate this rhythm over time. Second, and this is the specific food strategy, a small protein-focused snack approximately 2 hours before bed has been shown in clinical research to measurably blunt the overnight glucose release from the liver. Not a full meal, not a carbohydrate snack, a small, low-carbohydrate protein food, 2 tablespoons of natural peanut butter, a small handful of almonds or walnuts, about 15 to 20 pieces, 2 ounces of cottage cheese, a hard-boiled egg. That's it. Eaten about 2 hours before you go to sleep. I know this contradicts the advice many people have received about not eating before bed. And in general terms, avoiding large meals late at night is sensible. But this is not a large meal. It is a precisely timed small protein intake that gives the liver something to work with overnight, reducing the cortisol-driven glucose dump into the bloodstream in the early morning hours. Patients who add this single step after changing nothing else often see their fasting morning number improve within 3 to 4 weeks. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. And for people who have been frustrated by that morning number specifically, this is often the missing piece. Now I want to spend a few minutes on the foods themselves, because I've talked about strategies and timing, but I haven't been specific enough about which foods are particularly valuable here. Let me be direct. The foods that do the most work in blood sugar regulation for people over 65 fall into a few clear categories. Legumes. This means lentils, chickpeas, black beans, kidney beans, cannellini beans. These are among the most effective blood sugar stabilizing foods available. They contain a combination of slow digesting carbohydrate, fiber, and plant protein that produces the most gradual glucose release of almost any carbohydrate source. They are also inexpensive, filling, and versatile. If you can eat legumes 3 or 4 times a week as a side dish, in soups, in stews, they will have a measurable positive effect on your blood sugar pattern. Berries. Blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries. These are low in sugar relative to their volume, high in fiber, and rich in polyphenols, plant compounds that have been shown in multiple studies to improve insulin sensitivity and reduce post-meal glucose spikes. A small handful of berries added to Greek yogurt in the morning is a far better breakfast choice than fruit juice, even freshly squeezed juice, which removes the fiber and concentrates the sugar. Cruciferous vegetables. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale. These vegetables are high in fiber and contain compounds including sulforaphane that have anti-inflammatory properties relevant to insulin function. The chronic low-grade inflammation that becomes more common after 65 is one of the factors that worsens insulin resistance, and vegetables in this family help address it. Oily fish, salmon, mackerel, sardines, herring. Omega-3 fatty acids from these fish reduce systemic inflammation, support cell membrane function, which matters for how cells respond to insulin, and do not raise blood sugar at all. Aim for 2 portions a week at minimum. Nuts and seeds, almonds, walnuts, flaxseed, chia seeds. These contribute healthy fat and protein that slow glucose absorption when eaten alongside carbohydrates. A tablespoon of ground flaxseed stirred into yogurt or oatmeal is something I genuinely recommend. It is almost invisible in the food, and its effect on the blood sugar response to that meal is quite meaningful. And one final food note. Be cautious about foods that present as healthy but behave metabolically like sugar. Fruit juice, even without added sugar, produces a rapid blood sugar rise without the fiber buffer. Flavored yogurts, even low-fat ones, are often heavily sweetened. Granola bars and cereals, marketed as heart healthy, frequently contain more sugar than a biscuit. The food industry is not always your ally here. Read ingredient lists. If sugar, in any of its many names, fructose syrup, maltose, dextrose, glucose syrup, honey, agave, fruit concentrate, appears in the first 3 ingredients, treat that product with the same caution you'd treat a piece of cake. This is a good moment before I bring everything together to say something I think is worth hearing. If you have found what I'm explaining here useful, the kind of explanation that treats you as an intelligent adult capable of understanding your own biology, then I'd encourage you to subscribe to this channel. I make these videos specifically for people over 65 who are tired of vague reassurances and want clear evidence-based explanations of what is happening inside their bodies. Not tips and hacks, medical reasoning explained in plain language. That's what this channel is for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let me bring everything together into the practical framework I promised you. Because I want you to leave today with something you can actually do, not just understand. Here is the daily routine, step by step. In the morning, before anything else, drink a full glass of water, at least 250 milliliters. Your blood is slightly more concentrated after an overnight fast, and even mild dehydration makes blood sugar readings appear artificially elevated. Do this before coffee, before food, before anything. For breakfast, eat protein first. 2 eggs, Greek yogurt, smoked fish, or natural nut butter. After the protein, if you want oats, fruit, or toast, add it. But protein must come first. If your largest meal is lunch, approximately 15 minutes before you sit down to eat, drink 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar diluted in a large glass of water. Always diluted. At lunch, eat your vegetables first. Then protein, then any starchy component last. Add a small amount of olive oil over the vegetables. Take your time eating. Slow eating extends the digestive process and moderates blood sugar rise. After lunch, within 30 minutes of finishing, move for 15 minutes. Walk outside if you can. Walk inside if you cannot. Stand and do light movements. Anything that uses your leg muscles. In the afternoon, if you need a snack, make it protein and fat. Nuts, a piece of cheese, a hard-boiled egg. Avoid crackers, sweet biscuits, juice, or fruit on its own without protein alongside. At dinner, same meal sequence as lunch. Vegetables, then protein, then starch. If you use apple cider vinegar and your largest meal is dinner rather than lunch, apply it here instead. 2 hours before bed, eat a small protein snack. 2 tablespoons of peanut butter. A small handful of nuts. A hard-boiled egg. A small portion of cottage cheese. This is not optional if you are dealing with elevated morning fasting glucose. This step specifically addresses the overnight liver glucose release. That is the complete framework, 6 elements. Hydration in the morning. Protein first at every meal. Apple cider vinegar before your largest meal. Vegetables before carbohydrates. 15 minutes of movement after lunch. A small protein snack 2 hours before bed. No single element of this will transform your blood sugar on its own. But together, as a system, applied consistently over 6 to 8 weeks, the cumulative effect is meaningful. Not because of anything extraordinary, but because these 6 steps align with how your body actually works at this stage of life. Now let me be honest with you about what to expect. The first changes you are likely to notice will not be in your blood sugar numbers. They will be in your energy. Within 1 to 2 weeks of following the morning protein routine and the meal sequence change, most people notice more stable energy across the day. The afternoon fatigue is less severe. The mid-morning craving for something sweet diminishes. Sleep quality often improves slightly, partly because of the evening protein snack, partly because stable blood sugar overnight means less cortisol disruption in the early hours. Fasting blood sugar numbers typically take 4 to 6 weeks to show a meaningful downward trend. In some people, particularly those with longer standing insulin resistance, it may take closer to 8 to 10 weeks to see the numbers respond consistently. If you are monitoring your blood sugar with a home glucose meter, and I strongly encourage you to do so, if you are actively working on this, Look at trends over at least 14 days, not individual readings. A single high morning number can be explained by a poor night of sleep, a stressful day, a head cold, or mild dehydration. It is not evidence that the approach isn't working. The pattern over 2 weeks is what tells you the truth. And please, if you are on medication for blood sugar, whether that's metformin, sulfonylurea, insulin, or anything else, do not change your medication based on anything in this video. These strategies are designed to support what your physician is already doing. If your numbers improve significantly and consistently over several weeks, bring that data to your doctor and discuss it with them. Medication adjustments, when they happen, should always involve your physician. What you are doing here is adding to the picture, not replacing it.